Every time house prices take off, people say the same thing. This time, it's different. It never is. I studied the 5 largest property booms in history and found that every single one was baked using the same recipe, using these 5 core ingredients. And we're going to count down those massive property booms to reveal the ingredients that caused them and show you the sign it was about to flip into a bust. Because if you learn the recipe, you'll start to spot the pattern while it's happening instead of reading about it 10 years too late. The 5th largest housing boom in history was in Spain from 1997 to 2007. House prices went up 197%. They tripled, one of Europe's biggest modern housing booms. It started with the base ingredient of every major boom: cheap money. You see, back in 1999, Spain joined the Eurozone, and mortgage rates, which had been as high as 17% back in 1991, they tumbled to below 4% by the mid-2000s, some of the cheapest money in Europe. Now, cheaper money, so people took out big loans. So you've got all of this house borrowing, but it takes time to build houses, and that overflows into higher house prices. But of course, the good times, they wouldn't last, and Spanish house prices, they eventually began to look a little bit shaky. And what you're going to see with all of the other booms is that eventually the ingredients get used up and supply eventually catches up. And we saw that in Spain, because as house prices climbed, builders, they all piled in. They wanted to cash in too. And the number of new houses being built, it soared from like 250,000 a year to over 650,000 a year. That's a country of 45 million people building homes as if it were the United States. So now there are too many houses and not enough buyers to fill them. That forces the developers to compete for the buyers that are left, and house prices, they sink like a stone. In this case, Spanish house prices fell 45% from the 2007 peak over the next 6 years. It got so bad, we started hearing about ghost towns like Cesena, a development left half built and half empty for over a decade. Streets of empty apartments built for a boom that had already ended. But when it comes to the 4th largest boom in world history, we see the same core ingredient, but we're going to add another one in, and another one starts to take the lead. And look, as we go through this, don't worry about taking notes, because I've created you a free cheat sheet. It lays out the full recipe, the 5 ingredients, and the things that show up before property prices start crashing again. The links are down in the description, or you can just scan the QR code on your screen. And when you do grab that cheat sheet, you're going to see that the 4th largest boom happened around the same time as Spain. But this time it was in Ireland. Between 1996 and 2006, Irish house prices climbed by more than 270%. They nearly quadrupled in a decade. The average house went from 75,000 euros to 280,000 euros. Now, yes, the cheap money was there again, that sweet, cheap European cash. The lending tap turned on and the Irish started buying. But the second major ingredient, it was excellent, because while house prices were taking off, the Celtic tiger was roaring, and they had a booming economy. There were jobs everywhere, incomes climbing, the population, it was growing fast. And that makes house buyers and home buyers more confident. They've got the courage to go and buy more properties, borrow more, because they think that their incomes are going to keep on going up, because the economy, it's excellent, it's booming. And so what they do is they stretch themselves to see if they can afford that higher mortgage repayment. Now look, I don't want to over-egg the point, but when the economy is hot, you suddenly have a flood of people who all want a home, and because of the cheap money, they've all got the money to chase one down. And we saw what happened with Spain. It takes time for supply to catch up. Builders just couldn't put up homes fast enough, so house prices, they went vertical. And once that supply comes online and the lending tap gets turned off, well, what happens? Money gets more expensive, the buyers vanish, and over the next 5 years, Irish house prices fell 56%. That house that was worth 280,000 euros, it's now worth just a touch over 123,000 euros at the bottom of the market. And here's the lesson worth tattooing backwards on your forehead so you can read it in the mirror every morning. Housing booms don't end when people get nervous. They end when the credit, our base ingredient, gets pulled. But the third biggest boom in history has a hidden ingredient you wouldn't expect. And if you like this video, do me a quick favor and hit the like button, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. That's how I know which videos to do more of. Now, the third biggest property boom in the history of the world was in Hong Kong. Of course, their property boom started with our staple ingredient. Yes, they had cheap interest rates. No boom basically rises without one. But in this case, there was a quirk. Hong Kong's dollar had been pegged and is still pegged to the US dollar since 1983. And to hold that peg, Hong Kong has to roughly match US interest rates. So when America starts cutting their interest rates, Hong Kong, they get those cuts too, whether its economy needs it or not. Now, during the financial crisis, America, they slashed rates hard. And so Hong Kong was basically force-fed some of the cheapest money on earth, even as its own economy, it was doing fine. But cheap money isn't the ingredient that made Hong Kong special. The hidden ingredient, the one that you might not expect, was a previous crash. Because between 1997 and 2003, Hong Kong prices, they'd already collapsed like 61%. Prices had been beaten down so far that they had room to bounce back up. That is the milk in our recipe, a market that's already crashed because it's got further to climb. And this one absolutely did. Between 2003 and 2018, Hong Kong house prices went up 341%. Look, the market went mental. Towers sold out in hours. Agents, they ran lotteries for slots for people to view a property. People stretched into bigger and bigger loans because at those low rates, the payments, they still looked doable. And then the bus sign here was that the economy feels it. US interest rates went back up, Hong Kong's went up with them, and on top of that, a slowing Chinese economy. Well, the wind was knocked out of the demand. Cheap money in, expensive money out, plus that weaker economy. 5 years on, prices were down about 30% from their 2021 peak. 3 booms, 3 different lead ingredients, which raises a really critical question that you might have noticed. All 3 booms so far happened in the last few decades. Well, why is that? Well, remember, we only started getting really good house price data from the 1960s and 70s. Here in New Zealand, our Rolls-Royce of property data, that only starts from about 1992. So it's not just that the big booms happened recently, it's that these were some of the first booms we actually started to measure properly. And this point really matters, so you don't get fooled into thinking that property booms are only a recent trend, because the truth is that there were almost certainly bigger booms like in ancient Rome, where property trading and speculation, they were rife for thousands of years before anyone kept good house price records. But I still can't believe this is only boom number 2, because in just 4 decades, house prices in Japan went up 86 times over, one of the steepest, one of the most sustained climbs ever recorded in a major economy. So what set it off? Well, it had the usual ingredients. Post-war Japan, that was a growth miracle. Factories roaring, people pouring into the cities, and interest rates, they fell, so cheap money flooded in out of the banks. But the ingredient that made Japanese house prices sure to rise was the banks themselves. You see, the banks trusted land above all else. So when land prices rose, you could borrow more against your land, and what would you do with that money? You might go out and buy more land. Now that pushed prices up again, and that lets you borrow even more. Now round and round and round it went until by the late 1980s, Tokyo real estate had gone from expensive to mythical. The famous cocktail party stat was that the ground under the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was worth more than all the real estate in the entire state of California. So, what does the Bank of Japan do? It puts the interest rates up, and that triggered the ugliest bust sign of all, which meant that the banks pulled back, and it caused a property price death spiral. Falling land prices meant less to borrow against, which meant fewer buyers, which pushed prices down further, and that shrank borrowing again. And that's why Japan's bust broke the usual rule. Normally, house prices fall hard, and then they eventually claw back. But the Japanese property market ground to a halt, with house prices falling around 70% for over a decade. And they are the only property boom on this list where house prices dropped and still haven't fully recovered. Japan rose the most out of total on this list, 86 times, but no city in history has ever risen faster than number one. And that's the one that's still cracking right now, driven by the one ingredient we haven't added yet, because the largest property boom in history was in a little fishing village, a small Chinese settlement that became a megacity, home to Huawei, Tencent, and the electric car giant BYD. It's Shenzhen. Now, back in 2004, a teenager named Jackie Su moved there with his family. His family bought a pretty ordinary apartment in a non-central suburb. It felt expensive back then, about 4,000 renminbi per square meter, but fast forward 17 years, by 2021, that exact same apartment was going for nearly 80,000 renminbi per square meter, a 20-fold increase in that short time. And if you look at it over the same number of years, Shenzhen's boom actually outpaced even Japan's. A few years later, Jackie moved to New Zealand and now helps me research these YouTube videos. And through that research, we found that Shenzhen had a different ingredient from all of the others. It had our fifth and final ingredient that made house prices go boom. It added a little sugar into the mix. That sweet, say it with me, government policy. Shenzhen was one of China's first special economic zones. Part of the country's reform and opening up push, right? And the government drew a line on the map and said, inside here, the rules are different. So foreign investment poured in. Locals, they were suddenly free to experiment with the free market, and that opened the gates to the rest of the ingredients that you already know about. Cheap money that was turned on by the policy, the population that exploded from a small township to a megacity of around 18 million people. And even after prices have dropped from their 2021 peak, the average home still costs about 29 times what people actually earn. For comparison, Auckland's price to income ratio is about 7 times, so Shenzhen is roughly 4 times as unaffordable as Auckland. And the bus signs, they're shoving up right now. Prices have cooled about 40% since the 2021 peak. When prices float that far above what locals earn and what tenants can pay, something has to give. So that is the recipe for a house price boom. But just remember that the longer a boom is left to cook, the more burnt it becomes. Because what always happens in the end? Well, the developers, they see the boom, and what do? They build, and they build, and they build some more, right? And what inevitably happens is they pour that batter, they pour that housing demand into more and more cake tins. There's too much cake and not enough mouths to eat it, too many houses spread across, not enough buyers, and that's when the whole thing sinks, because every one of these booms ended the same way. The whole thing collapses and house prices come back down, which is why, as well as looking out for the booms, you really need to understand what makes house prices crash, which is why the next video I count down the biggest housing crashes in history and show you exactly what happens when the music stops. Click on the video on your screen, I'll see you in there.